Hey everybody, my name is Ian. Today we're talking about the Day of the Dead, one ritual, new folk costumes, and old identities by Rosa, Isela, Aguilar, Montes de Oca. I hope I am pronouncing most, if not all of that correctly. I really like this article. This article goes into a strange turn in the middle, in large part because it is part of a larger project, and then it was submitted to a special issue of Folklore, the electronic journal of folklore from out of Estonia, on folk costume. So it has a so I mean I think it does it very well, but you don't get a sense it's going to start talking about costume until like, oh, we're talking about costumes now. But other than that, I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think it's um, you could have a really interesting article despite talking without talking about the costumes, but the costumes become an interesting entry into it. So just to double back, she's talking about Day of the Dead in a particularly small community, not one of the large Mexican cities, not one of the large touristy cities of Mexico, but in the town of La Huasteca, and tracing it back. So there's a nice European style description of the origins of Day of the Dead. It has Mexica, or Aztec as it's more commonly referred to, origins in terms of placating and having a visit come of the dead, and particularly the praying to the dead ancestors in order to appease, calm, give bounty from the reasons that people pray to beings. Um, she talks about the syncretic elements where it is brought into already extant European efforts at taking over the Samhain, the Halloween, just to start using terms, a festival that takes place more or less halfway between the autumnal equinox and the winter solstice. So end of October by our calendar, and within that time, just as the last bit of we're still getting darker, and so the Catholic Church had already assumed a certain amount of feast time, and the Hallows Eve, and that becomes this praying for, not praying to, but praying for ghosts, basically, ancestors, and so on. And then that gets brought into Mexico in the 1600s, and you have this interesting dynamic blend of First Nations, Mexica, and Catholic theology. And then you have the influence of popular culture, which is typically in this sort of pushed, pulled away. There are one of the things is that it's something that happens alongside Halloween, and they know that it happens alongside Halloween because Mexico is in a position where they have so much influence from across the border, and so it is. Again, it is not a Halloween celebration, but it takes place at the same time, and there's a lot of collective will to keep the two distinct, to remove Halloween influences in terms of decoration, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the kind of candies or the kind of sweetness that takes place out of Day of the Dead, because Day of the Dead has the functions of a calendar custom in terms of the sort of the mythological basis. Okay, so this is a way in which this isn't the language that would be used, but this is us enacting our belief calendar. It's a strange way of putting it, but this is us enacting our belief calendar, and at this time, one of the things that we are doing is actually marking a rite of passage for those who have died. And we do it in this very ornate, stylized way. And like a rite of passage, that gives not only the sense of direction towards the individual and comfort for the individual and guidance for the individual and recognition of the individual as a loved member of the community despite their passaging, Passaging is not a verb, but I have just made it one. But also that sense of groupness. And it's that sense of groupness that I think is one of the things that motivates a lot of this article, because that sense of groupness is also now political. It's now also social. It is about carving out an identity, a Mexican national identity that is different from and distinct from the more, the potentially more powerful influences of Spain and particularly the United States. Spain, in terms of Mexico, because Mexico is a Spanish-speaking country, and obviously it has a Spanish heritage to it in terms of original colonizing power. In the 19th century, there was a sort of deferral of what comprised authentic Spanish culture, or what a Spanish language people ought to be, that was dictated by Spain in a way that's not dissimilar from the sort of relationship that Quebec has with France, and that France often becomes this sort of check on what authentic Frenchness should be at one point. And that's when we're sort of going back to Europe as these models of sophistication and models of advancement, and then the colonial remnants in former vestiges of empire defer to that model. And then there's an upswell. There's a division that upturns that model in the same way, again, that Quebec, not entirely, but less so, defines its sense of Frenchness against some kind of model from France. Mexico doesn't define its sense of Spanishness against some model from Spain. It is creating its own culture. It does that through food, and you can see that if you think of things like the changes in Mexican cuisine, where it was originally considered a sort of a peasant food with all the negative connotations that has, and that real restaurants, real sophistication is marked by American or European influences, and then through processes of nationalism and the Real Mexicano movement, if I have my name correct, it was the rediscovery of indigenous cuisine, Mexican food, as it were, and bringing that out of a street food, rural setting and introducing it into, and also the popular culture foods of sort of the influence of the parallel history of like Tex-Mex and so on, but creating a celebrated food culture that takes things like corn smut and huitlacoche and turns it into not a peasant food but an elite food. And so Day of the Dead Day of the Dead ceremonies, despite the fact that they vary from region to region, because Mexico is huge and with a lot of different influences and a lot of different, even if they were interrelated, a lot of different First Nations communities that have their own influences there. The general pattern of Day of the Dead is supported by the state. This is something that differentiates us from Mexico, from the United States, and differentiates us from Spain. This is a Mexican thing, and we will. It is good that we do that. One of the things that defines Mexico is participation in Day of the Dead, and you can look at that as a wonderful piece of state building, and you can look at that as cynical, because they are also aware of how they can use Day of the Dead imagery in advertising and tourism and so on. And that's always the question that we have when we talk about the intervention of the state in terms of culture. And then on one hand, yay, it's good because this will actually, we might not be able to do this otherwise. On the other hand, to what end? To what end are you doing this? But her article focuses on the small community, which doesn't have much in the way of tourism, as I said. This and the one that she went to, the Day of the Dead in 2011, there were only 2 people from outside. There was one reporter that she had encouraged to attend, and then there was Aguilar herself. And she, but nevertheless, it's this fascinating moment where 25 years ago, the community had seen various shifts. For one thing, there were elements of Day of the Dead, and there were elements of Mexican culture entirely, that in the thrust to sort of a new Mexican cosmopolitanism were nevertheless considered rural, peasant, so on. And she turns to forms of dress, and that this community, the traditional dress is a fairly elaborately ornamented shirt and sort of a similarly ornamented but slightly simpler long skirt, long sleeves, and you really only saw that among the aged women in the community. Most people had shifted to a more generically pan-North American style of dress. You also had the fallout of the local economy in terms of consolidation of farms and so on, drops in the prices of coffee, and you had outmigration. You had this community that didn't necessarily sustain itself in the same way, and we were probably familiar, if we're anywhere outside of major centers, we're probably familiar with that kind of flux in the community. And so their Day of the Dead became this opportunity to both celebrate, make themselves distinct, and practice and draw attention to their indigeneity and also their modernity. So they introduced this beauty pageant called the Miss CEMPOALXÓCHITL, and I'm sure I have mispronounced that, and my all apologies for that. But a beauty pageant, a incredibly North American, not that beauty is a North American concept, but the pageant, the very level of and design of the pageant, an extraordinarily American concept. People have talked about the origins of pageants and queens and so on, and that even has, like, prom queens and kings or Miss State Fairs and so on, that almost has a kind of carnivalesque attitude in terms of a local person of, yes, beauty, but low status is elevated to the position of queen, and given some kind of title. And that the thing about the pageant system in the United States, or at least the framing of pageant in the United States, is precisely that it is the bestowing of titles. It is giving this weird sort of aristocratic air to people. Again, sort of the king and queen aspect. But 5 young lasses are eventually whittled down, and they have to do things like find sponsors, and they have to go throughout the town and be supported in their quest for the pageant title. 5 become 5 enter into the final competitions, whittled down into 5, and then over the course of the 5 days of the Day of the Dead, there is one of the key aspects is this pageant. And this pageant is, and that's where the costume issue comes in, that every year there is a new costume that is inherently connected to the old forms of dress, and that it is a modern version of it. So it still has the embroidery, it still has the skirt, the dress, but it's now much more of a skirt. The embroidery is far more elaborate and not simply using the motifs of indigenous landscape and originating local Mexica mythology, but being used as exemplary items for sort of teaching points, as it were. And so it's this strange blend of a very new object, an object that is in part, what's the word I'm looking for? Not graded, in part assessed according to its almost pedagogical function, according to how much it sort of resonates with the local indigenous dress. Simultaneously, it is a modern piece of couture, and it is designed to fit the pan North American expectations of the body beautiful. So it is a pageant with all the gross body stuff that implies, in terms of the slender figure, tall, presumably some sort of bust and hips, and that kind of thing. So different from the bodies of the little old ladies in the market square. So it's this interesting blend of trying to use the modern, and I think Aguilar suggests succeeding in using the modern in this moment that is meant to be simultaneously recognizing the continuity with basically an ancient past. And we always talk in terms of custom of this dynamic tension between between what is brought forward and the bearing in mind that the bringing forward of something from previous iterations are always intentional acts. That every time this event happens, people have made efforts to put this event together. It doesn't exist without the conscious decisions of people. And they have decisions that are made in terms of what are we keeping, what has to be there, and what gives it that sense of this thing is recognizably similar to the thing that went before it, and that was recognizably similar to the thing that went before it. While simultaneously, A, for practical reasons, that all iterations are going to be different because circumstances change, and B, for aesthetic reasons, that adaptation is possible. It can change from point to point. Now, we have the issue that this thing is being supported in part by the state, and this thing is being supported in part by local businesses. And we have the introduction of all the complexities and all the issues about, well, all right, whose definition is going forward? What is the thing that is being celebrated? Is it Old Mexico? Is it New Mexico? Both are fine, but what is what is being celebrated the conflation of the two, the creative dynamism of the two? That that it is a complex and even sometimes contradictory, but vibrant and important and lively and spirited and distinct and unique and celebratable culture that can rest and sit alongside any of the other global cultures, even the ones that share far too much of the stage because of the power that lies behind those cultures. Or is it just a tawdry display event? I think she's pushing towards the latter, and I'm pushing towards. I think she's pushing towards the former, and I'm pushing towards the former. That there is much more there than the cynic might suggest. So it is this strange dualism, though, in terms of the small community, which is using Day of the Dead and still keeping the important functions of Day of the Dead. But now one of the key aspects, so you still have the creation of the altars, you still have the days, you still have the dances in the city streets that are meant to distract death. But now you have this pageant. And the one thing that gets me, and she writes it at the very end, where it has to do with the dress, it has to do with the pageant, which is the third element. This thing that is now, it's been going on for 25 years, and it is now part of this Day of the Dead celebration in this town. An expected part, an important part, a vibrant part, and a tradition by any stretch of the imagination. She uses the words new tradition, contradiction in terms, or intended. And it's like, well, no, new traditions can certainly happen. We can distinguish on a descriptive ones that have less or greater time depth, but that isn't a scale of authenticity. That's just a scale of their individual histories. But the thing that she mentions about the pageant is that why focus on the young women, and why use these dresses? Because one of the things that the young women have to do is also explain their dresses, explain their costume, explain their embroidery, explain the decisions that went into it. Even if they had other people help make them, they have to be the ambassadors of their own clothes, which becomes a really interesting thing, because fundamentally they are justifying their own embodiment. But as they are doing so, the idea is that the community, by encouraging women, the young women in this community, to be part of this pageant, to think in terms of pageantry, and they are actually inculcating the history of the place, the history of all the symbols that are on their that are on their clothing. You know, why these birds, why these skulls, why these flowers, that all the symbols have meaning. And if we think about the carnival, and we sort of think about calendar customs as being defined largely by identifying symbols, and now we have these costumes that are just replete with symbols, and someone who is there to explain them, someone whose role it is to explain them. What they are doing is, she explicitly says that they are reaffirming that culture and the onus, the duty to maintain culture, largely falls to women. And so as she says, the pageant serves to modernize the representation of gender and gender roles in town. The new ritual folk costumes promote the Huastec identity, but they are not related to monolingual women. Miss CEMPOALXÓCHITL, again, apologies, embodies the U.S.-American ideal of womanhood: modern, stylized, beautiful, tall, thin, and white-skinned. That's the first time she mentions white-skinned, by the way. Its dresses are adjusted to the bodies of more modern, Western young women. But at the same time, old attributes of a good woman are reinforced. Her role as the custodian of the culture, femininity, gracefulness, and orientation to family and housewifeliness. Both traditional and modern gender representations can be found in town. Most of the women decorate the altars and cook for the festivity, but some of them present themselves as Toltecan goddesses on the catwalk. Toltecan goddesses on the catwalk. I had never come across the adjectival form of Toltec before, and I had never said it aloud. So, again, we have this calendar custom. We have this thing that many people, in fact, ubiquitous throughout Mexico, in large part because it's encouraged. Its ubiquity is encouraged, and its ubiquity is there because this is something that, yes, it has the functional, or rather the ceremonial functional role of helping with the dead. But just as important, it is this conscious celebration of something that we do that others do not. That it is about Mexican identity. And we will continue to do so because it is about Mexican identity. And we will, as best we can, we can't do it always, as best we can, we will push away the more overt influences. And yet we are bringing in other elements. We're bringing in elements that seem to suggest, that seem to be of use. So it's not going to be pumpkins, because that's a Halloween thing and this is not a Halloween thing. But what if we pluck something from here? What if we pluck something from a midsummer festival, like a state fair, and have the pageant, and have that American influence, and create this new thing? Create this new thing that nevertheless appeals to old things, nevertheless appeals to that sense of continuity with the past, and in fact helps to cement that continuity with the past, and helps to cement that continuity in the past without necessarily bringing with it the things from the past that are sometimes still ambiguous in terms of how they are valued in a Mexico that sees itself as a contemporary cosmopolitan place. So it is still rural and peasanty, but it is not that sort of old-fashioned. And what is the difference between something being traditional and something being old-fashioned? And something being old-fashioned has that connotation of I think, has that connotation of no longer relevant. Well, traditional emphasizes its origins. Again, these are like common sense uses of the term. These aren't technical folkloristic terms, but I think we're still the language that we operate in on the day-to-day, on the vernacular level. Traditional emphasizes its origins, but suggests just a little bit more ongoing relevance. And I think if you here's the conclusion. If you frame certain things within that strange tension, the tension between what is old-fashioned and what is traditional, where you begin to sort of think of a group trying to integrate its past with its present in a way that it sees as ongoingly meaningful, ridding itself of the old-fashioned and embracing the traditional. Again, that's an incredibly notional, an incredibly arbitrary distinction between forms. But if you think that that question might be operative, I think you've got something really interesting to play with. Cool. That was not the conclusion that I was thinking I would have. So once again, we've been talking about Rosa, Isela, Aguilar, Montes, de Ocas, the Day of the Dead, One Ritual, New Folk Costumes, and Old Identities. Apologies all for my pronunciation. It's what happens when you really only know things by reading them. And I'll never have to say that word out loud. And then you decide you're going to commit it to celluloid. But as ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. My name is Ian. I will see you later. Bye-bye.